Introduction: The Unearthed Cemetery Beneath Main Street. Beneath the bustling sidewalks and flashing neon lights of Main Street lies a secretome that had been buried and forgotten for nearly a century. People walked these streets for decades, oblivious to what lay just a few feet beneath their shoes. Shops opened, traffic roared by, and life moved forward, all while the dead rested silently below. The discovery came by accident. A routine construction project aimed at modernizing the aging infrastructure revealed something far older. Workers stopped dead in their tracks as shovels struck wood and bone. Within hours, the entire block was cordoned off, police tape fluttering in the wind, and whispers spread through the town like wildfire. Main Street wasn't just built on history, it was built on graves. Urban exploration enthusiasts, always hungry for the thrill of the unknown, quickly turned their eyes to the site. To them, this wasn't just a discovery, it was an invitation. Abandoned tunnels, forgotten vaults, and crumbling headstones hidden beneath the city's surface. It was the kind of place that begged to be explored, even if it meant coming face to face with the forgotten souls who still lingered there. But this wasn't just any cemetery. According to historical records, this burial ground dated back to the late 1800s, a time when the town was little more than a handful of muddy streets and wooden shacks. The graves belonged to settlers, railway workers, and even soldiers whose names had been wiped from memory. And now, they were being brought back into the light, whether they wanted to be or not. The discovery has raised questions not just about the history of the town, but about the things we choose to forget. How does an entire cemetery vanish beneath a city's busiest street? And more importantly, why was it hidden in the first place? Join me as we descend into the shadowy depths of Main Street, uncovering its buried secrets, exploring the whispers of its restless dead, and discovering why some things are left better forgotten. Main Street wasn't always the bustling heart of the city that it is today. In fact, its origins trace back to the late 1800s, when it was little more than a muddy path cutting through a collection of wooden shacks and trading posts. Back then, the area was known simply as Crossroads, a stopover for settlers heading west and traders looking to peddle their wares. The town grew quickly. The arrival of the railroad brought with it an influx of workers, and with them came saloons, general stores, and a makeshift post office. Main Street was born, stretching out from the rail station, its cobblestones laid by hand and bordered by oil lamps that flickered against the night sky. It wasn't long before the town flourished, and Main Street became its spine center of commerce, gossip, and growth. But with growth came hardship. Illness swept through the town in the winter of 1893, a fever that burned through families, leaving entire households empty. It was during this dark period that the first graves were dug. At the time, the cemetery was a modest patch of land at the far edge of Main Street, marked with simple wooden crosses and stone markers etched by hand. Records from that time are sparse, but local legends speak of mass burials, rows of nameless graves dug hurriedly during the height of the sickness. Some say there were too many bodies to keep up with, that graves were layered on top of each other, the dead packed into the frozen earth without proper rites. By the turn of the century, the cemetery had expanded, swallowing up more ground as Main Street stretched farther into the growing town. For decades, families visited the graves of their loved ones, placing fresh flowers on headstones, whispering prayers for the departed. But as the city grew, so did its hunger for space. Main Street expanded, buildings went up, and the edges of the cemetery began to blur. Headstones were moved, boundaries shifted, and soon, construction crews began paving over the resting place of hundreds. By the 1920s, the cemetery was all but forgotten. Shops and cafes sprang up where tombstones once stood, and sidewalks covered what had once been sacred ground. Officially, the city had relocated the graves, but whispers persisted, stories of hurried work done at night, of unmarked bodies left behind, buried beneath the cobblestones of Main Street itself. Local historians tried to piece together the truth, but many of the records had been mysteriously lost. All that remained were faded photographs and the whispers of old-timers who still remembered the funerals that took place where modern storefronts now stood. For decades, it was just a story, an urban legend, passed down from one generation to the next. But then, a single strike of a shovel during routine construction brought it all back to the surface, both literally and figuratively. It began as a routine construction project, a simple sewage upgrade beneath Main Street. For weeks, crews had been tearing up cracked pavement, digging deep into the earth, their machines rumbling from dawn to dusk. But everything changed on a gray, rainy Thursday. A backhoe struck something solid, and the driver assumed it was just old piping. But when workers cleared away the dirt, they uncovered wood thick, splintered, and impossibly old. Shovels hit the ground, and the mud was scraped away with growing urgency. That's when they found it. A coffin. The wood was cracked, its edges warped with age, damp soil pressing in from all sides. The crew stepped back, stunned. Main Street had been bustling with life for decades: cafes, shops, traffic, but nobody knew it had been built over a burial ground. City officials arrived within the hour. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind as reporters gathered, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. The entire block was shut down, and more coffins began to emerge row after row, some intact. Others collapsed under the weight of the pavement above. Historians combed through old city records, searching for answers. Faded maps from the 1800s hinted at a burial ground on the edge of the original settlement, but by the 1920s, it had vanished from all official documents. No mentions. No maps. It was as if the cemetery had simply been erased. The city offered awkward explanations, talking about lost records and planned relocations, but locals weren't convinced. How could they pave over a cemetery and forget it was there? Whispers spread rumors of secret projects, hurried construction, and unmarked graves left behind. As more coffins surfaced, strange symbols began to appear carved deep into the rotting wood. Historians scratched their heads. The symbols didn't match any known local tradition. Some speculated they were protective marks, others thought they were warnings, but nobody knew for sure. The media called it the Main Street Catacombs, and the town's curiosity grew. Crowds gathered at the barriers, whispering stories of spirits disturbed, of shadows glimpsed in the fog. But for urban explorers, the discovery was something else entirely: an invitation. To them, this wasn't just a construction site, it was a hidden world beneath their feet. They spoke in hushed tones of slipping past the barricades at night, of crawling through the mud and darkness to uncover secrets that had been buried for a century. But what they didn't know was that some things are meant to stay buried. The discovery of the underground cemetery didn't just attract historians and news crews, it called out to a different kind of explorer. For urban explorers, the kind who creep through decaying factories and crawl beneath forgotten streets, the Main Street Catacombs were irresistible. It wasn't long before whispers spread of midnight visits, of slipping past barricades and descending into the muddy depths below. They came in pairs or small groups, flashlights flickering in the dark, backpacks stuffed with rope, cameras, and water bottles. For them, it wasn't just about curiosity, it was about claiming a piece of history that most people would never see. I first heard about it from Mason, a guy I'd known from the local urbex community. He sent me a grainy photo taken from beneath the wooden boards of Main Street. Coffins stretched out in rows, half sunken into the mud, some cracked open with age. His message was simple: "You in?" I didn't even hesitate. We met just after midnight, our breaths fogging the cold air as we slipped through the fence where construction had paused for the weekend. Main Street was silent. The lights of the shops dimmed, the streetlights casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. Mason held up the fence just enough for me to crawl through, and I hit the ground on the other side, mud squelching beneath my boots. The entrance was barely noticeable, just a patch of broken pavement pulled back like a curtain, revealing a jagged hole in the ground. Rusted ladders bolted to crumbling concrete led down into darkness. Mason clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. "Ready?" he asked, a grin stretching across his face. "Yeah," I replied, though my stomach knotted with unease. We climbed down, the metal groaning under our weight, each step sending echoes into the darkness below. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of wet earth and mold. I could hear water dripping somewhere far off, the sound bouncing off unseen walls. We hit the bottom, our boots sinking into thick mud. The tunnel stretched out before us, wooden supports holding up the earth, ancient and splintered. Mason shone his light forward, illuminating the first row of coffins. They were half buried in the mud, their lids cracked and warped, dark gaps where the wood had rotted away. "Look at that," Mason whispered, crouching next to one. Symbols were carved deep into the wood spirals and jagged lines, almost worn smooth with time. He traced a finger over one of them, his brow furrowed. "You ever seen anything like this?" I shook my head. "Not even close." We moved deeper, our light sweeping across rows and rows of forgotten graves. Some of the coffins were splintered and broken, their contents long gone or buried deeper in the mud. Others looked untouched, their surfaces slick with moisture, preserved by the cold, damp earth. That's when we heard it. A whisper, soft and distant, like it was carried on a breeze that shouldn't exist so far underground. We both froze, our lights fixed ahead. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Mason nodded slowly. "Probably just wind," he muttered, but his voice wavered. Wind didn't sound like voices. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. "We should keep moving," I said, forcing my legs to move forward. The whispering faded, but the silence that followed was even worse. It felt heavy, pressing down on us, as if the weight of the earth above was reminding us where we were, beneath Main Street, beneath a century of footsteps and forgotten graves. We moved deeper, our footsteps muffled by the mud. Around the next corner, the tunnel widened, opening up into a chamber where the walls were lined with shelves. Wooden planks, sagging under the weight of boxes and glass jars. I stepped closer, brushing away dust. Mason's flashlight flickered, and for just a moment, I thought I saw movement. A shadow, slipping between the rows. "Mason?" I started, but when I turned, he was already moving forward, deeper into the dark. Mason moved ahead, his flashlight beam slicing through the thick darkness. The chamber stretched out before us, shelves sagging under the weight of rotting wood and dust-covered glass jars. I hurried to catch up, my footsteps echoing off the damp stone walls. The air was colder here, dense with the smell of wet earth and mildew. It felt heavy, pressing against my lungs with each breath. "What is all this?" I whispered, running my fingers along one of the shelves. My hand came away covered in dust, thick and greasy, like it had been untouched for decades. Mason shrugged, shining his light over rows of rusted tools, glass vials filled with cloudy liquid, and cracked, leather-bound books with no titles. "It's like they just left everything down here," he murmured, picking up one of the books and brushing away the dust. The leather crumbled under his touch, flakes drifting to the floor. He opened it carefully, the pages whispering as they turned. His flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. I took a step back, shining my own light around the room. Symbols were scratched into the stone, some faint, others deep and jagged. Spirals, crosses, and shapes I didn't recognize. Their lines uneven, like they had been carved in haste. "Did you see these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mason looked up, his brow furrowing. He walked over, tracing one of the symbols with his gloved hand. "This isn't graffiti. It's old. Really old." A gust of cold air swept through the tunnel, rattling the shelves. I jumped, my flashlight beam jerking across the walls. Mason laughed nervously. "Relax, it's just air pressure." "Air pressure?" I echoed, glancing around. "We're 30 feet underground." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked further into the chamber, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I followed my shoes, sinking into the mud with each step. The deeper we went, the thicker the fog seemed to get, thin wisps of mist curling around our legs, clinging to the floor like it didn't want to let go. Mason stopped suddenly, his light fixed on something at the far end of the room. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I squinted into the dark. At first, I thought it was just another pile of debris, maybe a collapsed section of the wall. But as I stepped closer, the shapes came into focus. Wooden boxes coffins stacked 3 high, stretching from one end of the chamber to the other. Most were intact, sealed shut with rusted nails, but some were broken. Their lids cracked open, shadows spilling out like smoke. I leaned forward, shining my light into one of the open ones. The wood was dark with age, splintered and warped, but inside, there was nothing. No remains, just empty space and the faint scent of damp earth. "That's weird," I murmured. Mason came up beside me, his flashlight flickering. "Maybe they cleared them out already?" "Maybe," I trailed off, glancing around the room. But it didn't make sense. The coffins weren't just empty, they were untouched, as if nothing had ever been buried there in the first place. Mason took a step back, his light sweeping over the rest of the rows. "I don't like this," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. His flashlight flickered again, then cut out entirely. "Damn it," he muttered, shaking it. I raised mine, the beam stretching into the shadows. That's when I saw it. Movement. At the far end of the chamber, just for a second, something shifted. A shadow slipping between the rows. There and gone before I could blink. My heart lurched. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Mason shook his flashlight, swearing under his breath. "What? There's someone down here." He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking," I hissed, pointing toward the far wall. "Right there. It moved." Mason stared into the darkness, his jaw clenched. "There's nobody here, man. We're the only idiots crazy enough to come down here." The whisper returned. Faint, lingering, coming from somewhere deep in the tunnels. Both of us turned at the same time, flashlights trembling. The whisper grew louder, stretching through the silence, curling around us like fog. It didn't sound like words, more like humming. A soft, melodic tune just out of reach. "Okay, I think we've seen enough," Mason whispered, already backing toward the exit. I nodded, my legs shaking as I followed. But as we turned, I caught one last glimpse of the open coffins and saw faint handprints pressed into the mud around their edges. When news of the discovery spread, it wasn't just historians and urban explorers who took interest. The entire town began to buzz with rumors and whispered stories tales of secret burials, hasty construction, and the things that were supposedly left behind. Local legends were dredged up from the past, tales that had almost faded from memory. Some of the older residents remembered hearing stories from their grandparents' warnings never to dig too deep around Main Street, whispers of bodies that hadn't been properly buried. They spoke of shadowy figures glimpsed at dusk, walking the cobblestones before fading into nothingness. The most popular theory was that the original cemetery wasn't just neglected, was intentionally hidden. Documents from the early 1900s mentioned a rapid expansion of Main Street, with construction crews working double shifts to pave over the old burial ground. Officially, the bodies were said to be relocated to the new cemetery on the edge of town. But those records were suspiciously sparse, and nobody seemed to remember any large-scale exhumations. Some claimed it was a matter of money. Developers wanted the land for storefronts and housing, and the cemetery was simply covered up. Others whispered of something darker. They spoke of land disputes, of angry families who had been forced out, their loved ones buried and forgotten beneath layers of concrete and cobblestone. The symbols carved into the coffins added more fuel to the mystery. Local historians pored over old texts, searching for matches, but the symbols didn't correspond with any known religious or cultural markings. The spirals, jagged lines, and crude crosses seemed almost ritualistic, as if they were meant to seal something away rather than honor the dead. One theory suggested the cemetery had been used for more than just burials. During the late 1800s, there were rumors of underground gatherings of secret societies that held ceremonies away from prying eyes. Some speculated that the symbols were wards, meant to keep spirits contained, to lock them underground. Others believed the opposite, that they were invitations, markings to call something back. There were even whispers about the midnight bells, a local legend that had all but vanished from memory. According to the stories, Every year, on the anniversary of the last burial, the sound of church bells would echo beneath Main Street, even though no church had stood there for nearly a century. Those who claimed to have heard it said the bells weren't calling the living, they were calling the dead. Local paranormal enthusiasts latched onto the stories, claiming the unearthed coffins were proof of lingering spirits. Some swore they saw lights flickering in the tunnels at night, shadows moving behind the barriers set up by the city. One explorer, who had slipped past the barricades just a week after the discovery, described hearing whispers in the dark, soft and distant, like voices carried on a cold breeze. And then there were the handprints. Dozens of them had been found pressed into the mud near the open coffin small, childlike prints that seemed far too fresh to have been left by the original burials. The city dismissed it as settling soil, but locals weren't so sure. Whispers grew louder, stories of sightings increased. Some claimed to hear footsteps in the empty alleys after midnight. Others spoke of fleeting glimpses of figures in dark windows, watching from the shadows. It became clear to everyone who lived in the town, whatever lay beneath Main Street wasn't resting quietly. The discovery of the underground cemetery beneath Main Street stirred up more than just rumors. It drew the attention of historians, archaeologists, and urban explorers eager to uncover its secrets. Local news stations ran interviews almost daily, featuring experts who tried to make sense of how an entire graveyard could be buried and forgotten. Dr. Emily Hargrove, a professor of urban archaeology at the State University, was one of the first to visit the site. Standing in front of rows of unearthed coffins, she spoke with the kind of uneasy fascination that only an archaeologist could have. "It's not just the fact that the cemetery was buried," she explained during a live interview. "It's how it was buried. The bodies are aligned perfectly, too perfectly for something that was supposedly relocated in haste." When asked about the symbols carved into the wood, she hesitated. "I've seen markings like this before, but not in a cemetery. These are protective symbols, or maybe binding ones. Their purpose was to keep something in, not just mark a grave." Her words sent a chill through the audience, sparking even more speculation. Local historian Mark Evans had his own theories. In a recorded interview, he pulled out a collection of old maps and faded photographs, spreading them across his cluttered desk. "This town has secrets," he said, tapping a finger on a sepia-toned map of Main Street from 1892. "This whole section was marked as sacred ground, but by 1920 it's gone. Paved over like it never existed. The city grew fast back then. They were expanding, modernizing, but some things were just left behind." Evans leaned back in his chair, lowering his voice. "I've heard stories from the old-timers. They talk about the midnight bell show. You can hear them echo under Main Street once a year. People think it's just a myth, but I'm not so sure." Urban explorers also began to share their experiences, though most spoke anonymously. One group, who slipped past security barriers late one night, described descending into the tunnels armed with flashlights and GoPro cameras. "It was quiet at first," one of them recalled, his voice shaky in the recording. "We got about 50 feet in, past the coffins and those weird symbols. That's when we heard it whispering. Not loud, just soft, like someone was talking right behind us. We turned around, but there was nothing, just shadows and fog." The video footage they uploaded online was shaky, lit only by flashlights. But the whispers were there, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the tunnels like echoes from another time. Another explorer, who identified himself only as Red, spoke about what he saw while exploring alone. He described navigating the lower tunnels, far beneath the main excavation site. "There's more down there," he whispered in the interview, eyes wide and unblinking. "Chambers and rooms, places that aren't on any map. And there are footprints, fresh ones, but I never saw anyone else down there. Not alive, anyway." Red wouldn't say much more, only that he wouldn't be going back. When asked why, his response was simple. "There are things that walk those tunnels that shouldn't still be walking." Even the city workers stationed at the site began to report strange occurrences. One night guard, assigned to patrol the excavation site after hours, resigned after just 3 days. When asked why, he simply replied, "I'm not getting paid enough to listen to dead people whisper my name." The city tried to play it off as superstition, the result of overactive imaginations stirred up by media coverage. But locals weren't so sure. To them, the truth was simple. Whatever lay beneath Main Street had been sleeping for a long time, and now it was awake. The discovery beneath Main Street was more than just the unearthing of old bonesit. It was a revelation of forgotten history, buried secrets, and the unsettling realization that some things never truly rest. As archaeologists continue their careful excavation, more questions arise than answers. The coffins, the symbols, the whispers, in the dark they suggest that what lies beneath the city isn't just a cemetery. It's something older, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Local officials have cordoned off the area, vowing to investigate thoroughly. But for many in the community, the damage is already done. Shops near the dig site report strange noises after hours, whispers that flit just beyond hearing, footsteps echoing on empty sidewalks. Lights flicker and go out for no reason, and shopkeepers swear they've seen shadows moving just beyond the glass after midnight. Urban explorers continue to slip past barricades, returning with stories of dark tunnels and impossible chambers that stretch far beneath the city. Some claim to have seen figures moving in the shadows, pale and silent, watching from the edges of the light. Most come back shaken, unwilling to speak about what they saw. A few don't come back at all. And then, of course, there are the bells. The Midnight Belsa legend, almost forgotten until the cemetery was unearthed. Every year, just once, they say you can hear them echoing beneath Main Street. Not from a church tower or a building, but from somewhere underground. A deep, resonant toll that carries through the fog-covered streets, growing louder with each chime. Locals used to say it was just an old superstition, a ghost story to keep children indoors after dark. But this year, people are listening more carefully. The excavation site remains heavily guarded, floodlights casting harsh shadows across the exposed coffins and crumbling tunnels. But some believe it's too late. The ground has been disturbed, and whatever slept beneath Main Street is awake now, stirring just below the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. There are whispers of a final chamber, deeper still one that hasn't been uncovered yet. Maps from the 1800s show hints of it, a forgotten vault marked only as the tomb. City officials deny its existence, but the explorers who've slipped past the barricades tell a different story. They speak of blocked passageways and walls covered in strange markings, paths that seem to stretch on forever before abruptly ending. Nobody knows what's inside the tomb, or why it was sealed away and forgotten. But there's one thing that everyone agrees on. The bells are getting louder. Perhaps it's only a matter of time before the dead decide to walk Main Street again.